Financial Modeling, Topic 20, NPV, IRR, and Other Investment Rules. Section 2, we're going to compute the most common measures used to evaluate investments. We're going to use average accounting return, payback period, discount payback period, NPV, Profitability Index, and IRR. And we're going to continue with our same example that we've had on the boat charter. So let's calculate the first one, average accounting return. Average accounting return is simply the average investment's net income. So the average net income over the life of the project over the average net book value of assets, or also called the investment asset book value. And the investment rules accept all projects that have some rate of return greater than whatever you specify. So going to our spreadsheet, I have my average income. We can call this net income, even though it's EBIT after tax, but if there's no interest expense, that is my net income. And then I have my book value of assets over here. So I'm just going to simply take the average of my income for all years divided by the average of my book value of assets. So the average return turns out to be 15.32% return. So again, you would accept all projects that have some rate of return greater than some specified value. So if you said, I want to accept all projects greater than 10 or 15% return, you would do this project. If you require a 20% return, you would not. So let's go to another measure, payback period. Payback period measures the number of years it takes to pay back the initial investment in cash. So the investment rules accept all projects in which the payback is less than some minimum payback period. So say you want to make sure you're paid back within 6 or 7 years. So we're going to calculate the payback. What I'll do is I'll go to my free cash flows right here, and let's calculate something called cumulative free cash flows. Remember, this is period 0. So I'm going to start off in period 0, 165,000 in the red. I'm in the hole. And then at the end of the first year, I'm going to add to it the $31,000. So I'm still in the red, still a negative cumulative free cash flow. And we'll see what year it turns positive. So it looks like it's going to turn positive in year 6. So the first non-negative period is the payback period. So we say this takes 6 years to pay us back. And again, we would accept all projects in which that payback is less than some specified minimum. And that's very similar to this is something called the discounted payback. You're going to do the same thing, except you're not going to use the cash flows. You're going to use the present value of the cash flows. So if I actually have this done for you here, here's the present value of cash flows. So notice there's my 165 over 1 plus my discount rate to the 0 power, 1 power, and so on. So this is the present value of all cash flows. If I just take the cumulative present value of cash flows, the first year in which it is non-negative appears to be year 8. So in that case, my discounted payback is 8 years. My next measure, net present value. This is the main measure which firms use, including IRR. And in finance theory, it should be really the one rule you should use all the time. And NPV is just the sum of the present value of all cash flows. And in theory, you accept all projects which the NPV is greater than 0. And what that does, that ensures that you've earned that discount rate, a rate of return equal to or greater than that discount rate. So if I go to my spreadsheet, notice I've calculated the present value of all the free cash flows. If I just sum up those cash flows, equals sum of all the free cash flow, present values of cash flows, I'll call that my NPV. Now, what does it mean to have an 11,356 NPV? What it means that when I applied the 12% discount to the cash flows, this number turned out to be greater than 0, which means that this return is actually greater than a 12% return. So what I'm going to do is use another way of calculating NPV, and that is don't do the extra work here. I could use Excel's NPV function equals NPV, where I specify a discount rate, comma, and then I just put in the free cash flows, undiscounted free cash flows. But I can't start with period 0. Actually, I need to start with period 1, because Excel's NPV function if you look at the parameters, notice it says the rate is the discount rate, and it says that the value 1 is the series of cash flows, and it starts in period 1. So notice it says value 1, value 2, and so on. It doesn't say start today. So when I use the NPV function, I can only start with cash flows to start next period. However, I need to add to that function the initial cash outlay. So the NPV is 11,356, just like it would calculate it, but with Excel's NPV function, you have to start with period 1 cash flows and NPV and add back the period 0 outlay. So again, for NPV, we just accept all projects that have a 0 or greater NPV. So even a 0 NPV is a good project, because what it's telling you is you're earning exactly 12% rate of return, which is the rate of return you thought was fair. Profitability index is very close to the NPV function. It just takes the present value of all future cash flows divided by the negative of the present value of the initial investment. So if I do that calculation and I just sum up the present value of all those positive cash flows in the future and divide by the negative of my 165 investment, I get 1.07. And what this means, if it's equal to 1, that means the present value of the future cash flows is equal to the present value of the initial cost. What that means is the NPV is equal to 0 if this index is 1. So any profitability index greater than 1 means that the NPV is positive. So it's just another way of thinking about NPV. And I would accept all projects that have a profitability index greater than 1, which means that they have an NPV greater than 0. The last one is internal rate of return, the IRR. The IRR has two interpretations. It's the average annual rate of return of cash flows, and that's the rate of return over the initial rate of return on the initial investment. The other one is the discount rate that makes the NPV equal to 0. So I'm going to go ahead and calculate the IRR, and I can do it two ways. Whoops, let me bring back that spreadsheet. I can, one, use an IRR function equals IRR, and I'll put in just the cash flows, not the cumulative cash flows and not the discounted cash flows, but just the cash flows. And there's my 13.72%. Notice it's greater than 12. I knew it had to be greater than 12 because the NPV is greater than 0. The other way of calculating NPV is use goal seek. I could just on data, what if, data, what if, goal seek. I could set the NPV to a value of 0 by changing this discount rate. And what you'd find is the only discount rate that makes the NPV 0 is 13.72, but I'll hit cancel. So that is the other way to calculate IRR. So in this topic, we calculated all the major risk measures: NPV, IRR, profitability index, payback, discounted payback, average counting return. A couple things I want to mention before we move on to the next topic is this. One, when we talk about the IRR and NPV as the main two measures, the question is which measure should you use? Well, in general, they give you the same answer, just like we did, looked at our example for our boat. However, there are situations where you get different answers, and that happens when the signs of cash flows change more than once. And say you have an investment that cost you $100 today, you make $200, and then you lose $300 or $130. Maybe it's like the cleanup period of this project. Whenever the signs change more than once, in other words, going from negative to positive, then positive to negative, mathematically it's possible to get two IRRs. And actually, if you look at this project investment, if I looked at the NPV of this project, I would get a certain value, one value. However, if I looked at the IRR, what I'd notice is there's two possible IRRs. When the discount rate is 10% or 20%, both of those give me 0 NPVs. So for that reason, I'm never going to use IRR when the cash flows switch signs more than once. The second reason is generally in finance, our concern is about cash. We don't try to maximize cash. So the other reason I want to always use NPV is that if I'm trying to maximize my cash, NPV tells me that value. My goal isn't to maximize rates of returns, but it's a useful metric to see. My goal is really to maximize cash. Another thing to mention when we're using IRRs is projects can be either independent or mutually exclusive. Independent projects means you can have those projects be selected or unselected, and the selection of one project is not relied on the decision on another project. However, you could have mutually exclusive projects which are dependent on the selection or rejection of another investment. For example, what if you had a project, an investment to build a restaurant or a convenience store on the same property? Obviously, you can't do both. So these two projects are mutually exclusive. Now, IRR is not an appropriate measure to select mutually exclusive projects because ultimately you really care about cash flow. And therefore, I don't really care if a project gives me a higher rate of return. I really care which project makes me richer. So in this topic, we calculated the most common measures: average accounting return, payback period, discount payback period, NPV, profitability index, and IRR. And by the way, the main one we should be using every day is NPV, because that tells me specifically whether a project is going to make me wealthier. It creates cash.